Ladies and gentlemen, I would like first to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak to you today. And we have spoken up to now mainly about global issues. I want to concentrate in my contribution on something regional, on something which affects Europe, which affects those of us who were born and are living here in our continent and who are now struggling with a turmoil where our integration process was trapped. So I'd like to, I am not a specialist in culture policy and soft power and all of that, but I would like to share with you some opinions I feel relevant for contemporary developments, and maybe I will be a little bit provocative, but I think it should be the aim of the lecture also. I want to talk about identity from European perspective. You know, the phenomenon of identity it's a fundamental bond of a society which creates a sense of belonging and cohesion among members of the society, and from which also the existence of solidarity follows. Identity, in my opinion, has a number of elements. This feeling collectively distinguishes its bearers from mankind as a whole, enables them to define themselves with respect to it and share opinions and attitudes. Its essential elements usually comprise such shared components like historical experience, culture, religion, very often common language, and numerous other features. I think each of us, every individual, carries a number of individual identities, and inside of us there is a certain hierarchy of them, and everybody keeps them in his consciousness. Through these identities, people perceive the world and evaluate what's going on around them and experience these identities together. It's a value of a certain kind. In this context, European integration, in the process of European integration, we hear a lot about European identity. And this identity is a little bit vague notion. It's being searched in so-called common European values, Christianity, Jewish as well as Greco-Roman roots of European culture, humanism, and legacy of Enlightenment, gradually predominant democratic traditions, etc. But I think that these values which are undoubtedly present in societies of individual EU member states with varying degree and intensity, are rarely seen as something specifically European. Perhaps we will all agree that their unifying strength can by no means be offset by what divides European nations. And I have used deliberately the word nations. Exactly the notion of a nation and national identity is the main distinctive attribute with which contemporary European identity themselves and divide the member states. On the contrary, the sense of European belonging and European identity are derived, secondary, and in a number of cases still rudimentary. Most of modern European countries were established as national states, often with the use of force and as a result of wars, revolutions, and as a solution of national antagonisms. In some parts of Europe, this process has taken place very recently, or on some places is still going on. The nationalism that used to be a breeding ground of European conflicts is rightly condemned, but there is no quick and easy way of overcoming the deeply divided national sentiments and replacing them by a certain pan-continental identity that the citizens of European countries would be willing to accept. However, national states did not bring only conflicts in modern history. On their foundations, it was possible to establish functional political democracy based on freedom of an individual and his rights. It was no coincidence that the establishment of democracy was closely linked to the establishment of modern national states in Western Europe. It may even be said that the establishment of national states was a necessary precondition for the establishment of a modern European democracy. By contrast, large multinational empires in the European East weren't able to establish a functional democracy, and therefore it was no coincidence that all multinational states in Europe gradually disintegrated as a result of national conflicts. The present European Union still bears this legacy. It is a union of national states whose inhabitants are internally united and externally divided by different national identities, traditions, and historical experience related to them, as well as by fears, prejudices, and potential antagonisms. This is a reality from which we have to start. It cannot be simply overcome by an attempt to artificially regionalize Europe, by transfer further and further powers and competencies to Brussels, by new treaties and legislation, or by artificial centralization and unification, or even by bureaucratic and administrative regulation. By ignoring this reality, it may easily happen that after a certain limit is crossed, the EU may change from an entity reconciling old conflicts and preventing new ones into a playground for new nationalisms, national antagonisms and conflicts, leading to the destiny of such states like the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, which used to be for the Czechs, Germans, and a number of other nations in Central Europe, home for several centuries. I would like to illustrate my general remark on a Czech example. Czech national identity originated upon the establishment of a modern Czech nation on a linguistic and territorial basis, and to a considerable extent also on the basis of specific Czech historical experience. This is all reflected, among other things, in the Czech attitude towards contemporary European issues. The present Czech Republic is ethnically a very homogeneous state with a 1,000-year tradition of its own statehood, mature culture, economy, and it's a country which traditionally shared Western European culture and values. However, the way our nation gained this modern statehood and sovereignty was very difficult, and its establishment was complicated and not without conflicts, and its existence is therefore perceived by our citizens as a special value. If we look at the 1,000 years of Czech history, we see that the Czech state has always been a clear entity, a homeland of the Slavonic ethnic group, but at the same time, throughout most of its history, always a semi-independent or non-independent part of a broader entity known as the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. We were linked to the German world culturally and politically. Czech rulers used to receive their royal title from the German emperor. They belonged among his privileged electors, and later German emperors at the same time held the position of a Czech king. Cultural stimuli from the world reached us through the German-speaking countries, and in addition to that, German colonization changed the national composition of inhabitants of the Czech lands and interlinked the Czech state with the German world even more. Our relationship towards Germany has always been crucial for us, both in history and in modern times, and has considerably affected the Czech historical experience and opinion about the position of our country in Europe. Modern Czech nation was established under the influence of similar processes in Western Europe and in Germany in the 19th century, and German nationalism which strived for unification of all German lands, which included also historical Czech lands, was in this sense antagonistic towards Czech nationalism, which had fought for the preservation of identity of a linguistically different Slavonic nation. Nevertheless, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into which the Czech politicians put their hopes, envisaging it to be a protector of a small nation, failed in this respect. Then the shock of World War I and Austria's disintegration made the Czech national aspirations come true. However, the newly established democratic Czechoslovakia inherited national conflicts of the past and potentially problematic relationship with neighboring Germany, which tragically culminated following the rise of Nazism. Attempts at rooting Czechoslovakia in international structures were determined practically throughout its whole existence by a fear of its big Western neighbor. Between World War I and World War II, it was materialized in an alliance with France and Britain, which failed fatally in Munich in 1938. After the tragic World War II experience, it was behind an attempt at an alliance with the Soviet Union, which quickly led to a communist coup d'etat and fall into the position of a Soviet satellite. The fall of communism, restoration of democracy, and accession into the European Union meant a new beginning for us. After almost 100 years of intentionally moving away from Germany, we have now, on our will and choice, entered a European structure where Germany is the strongest and in the Central European area a clearly determining force. However, there is a major difference from the past. Today's Germany is a mature and peace-loving democracy, our ally in the NATO, and a major economic partner and country which is very close to us in all other aspects. It gives us all a great opportunity for the future. However, this opportunity should not be wasted by forgetting what has preceded. The new Europe, the new Europe will ignore the experience and feelings of small nations who had to fight hard for their statehood and sovereignty. that under the slogan of easier decision-making, the EU will try to subordinate the lives of our citizens to a comprehensive external bureaucratic dictate, that it will ignore that they insist on their freedom and democracy, which they fought for so hard, and which the EU structures are even more distant from. Czechs have their historical experience. They know well what it means to lose freedom, and they also knew well what it means to live under a rule they do not see as their own, but foreign. In this respect, they are far more sensitive than the citizens of Western European countries, whom history has saved from similar historical challenges. Czechs have a long-term negative experience with great illusions and vain hopes, which are so easily to awaken, but are only rarely fulfilled. Communism was also such a great and tragic illusion. That is why the Czechs are skeptical. They have heard so much about brotherhood, eternal alliances, etc., and they know well how it all eventually ends. They have their negative experience with artificial communist internationalism and know that multiculturalism is a false illusion threatening to disintegrate society from the inside. They do not trust any good enforced from the outside. Historical experience tells us that sovereignty and freedom may be lost very easily, yet are extremely difficult to regain them. We should not forget that the process of constant transferring of powers in all fields from national states to Brussels may very easily make nations with a similar historical experience as the Czechs have feel that the old times are back and that they are again controlled by somebody from the outside. Similarly, one can speak about the specifics of every nation in today's EU. The diversity of their identities, traditions, culture, customs, and historical experiences has always represented a wealth of the continent. However, current direction of European integration seems to perceive it as a problem. This is where the attempt to subordinate all aspects of the lives of inhabitants in member states to artificial common rules stem from. Although it has never been said openly, it's a persistently and permanently, there is a permanently pursued objective that regardless of this diversity, pushing the European Union into gradually centralized superstate, a new great power competing with the US, China, Russia, and other global players. Superpower ambitions may perhaps be close to the hearts of elites from some former European powers, but Czechs and a number of other smaller European nations do not share them. They do not see the need to compete with the US, to which Europe owes a lot for its post-war reconstruction, security and stability. We already once in the past had to be involved in a global rivalry due to ambitions of another big power and against our will, and we remember these outcomes. The non-existence of a single European political nation, different national identities, and different national interests do not make it possible to build functional democratic mechanisms at pan-European level. EU members and their citizens are not ready to be subordinated to others making decisions about their own affairs. It's not only that small countries would see a problem in subordinating to the big ones. Even big countries are unwilling to accept situations where a majority of others would force them to take decisions against their own interests. This can be well illustrated on the current situation in the euro area against the background of the Greek public finance crisis. The core issue is not that Greece is to be blamed for cheating and wasteful governments. The main problem is that a sustainable common currency requires a common economic policy and fiscal transfers, and that it also needs undeniable broad solidarity that would support weaker regions. However, the necessary degree of mutual solidarity is lacking among the EU nations. Germans were willing to bear huge costs of the German reunification because within Germany such a feeling of mutual solidarity exists. Nevertheless, they are unwilling to make the same sacrifices vis-à-vis Mediterranean countries. It's similar with other rich Nordic nations. They do not accept that majority of others would decide about the use of the savings of German citizens. On the other hand, Greeks are unwilling to accept that they would be rid of their right to decide their own affairs and would become a kind of protectorate of the others. It's clear how the politically motivated project of Euro had ignored the reality and non-existence of both economic prerequisites, which is the optimum monetary area, and real political preconditions for a long-term successful functioning of such an attribute of a unified state that the common currency represents. This confirms an assumption that contemporary Europe is not ready for ever-deepening integration process. If we were still unwilling to admit it, and if dubious methods will still be used for implementing steps such as the Lisbon Treaty that will push the continent towards a superstate behind the back of citizens, we will see a repetition of conflicts of the past that we hoped were gone forever. We will lose freedom and democracy, we will stir up antagonisms of the controllers and the controlled, and will again provide a leeway from the rebirth of nationalism. The European project cannot be pursued in a technocratic and social engineering manner. It cannot go ahead of development. It is preconditioned by the existence of a truly lively and broadly felt European identity that would make it possible to form a European political nation. I am not saying whether this vision is realistic at all. Nevertheless, it's a process that would take a number of generations, not an issue for the near future. In order to see the formation of something like that, we would need a long existence of a barrier-free Europe, Europe where the exchange of good, capital, values and people take place freely, and not the unlimited and ever-expanding scope of decision-making in Brussels taken away from us and not accountable to anyone. Thank you.